Well, good evening. I know that some of you are still getting seated and getting some refreshments, and I would encourage all of you, even if you've already had some refreshments, feel free to go back at some point this evening and go for round two. But we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, and welcome to the second of two events in Reimagining Faith and Public Life 2025. I'm Daniel Bennett. I'm a professor of political science at John Brown University and the director at the Center for Faith and Flourishing, which serves as the primary sponsor for this series. The Center for Faith and Flourishing was founded in 2019 to encourage students and the broader community to ask and address some of today's most pressing questions and to encourage enriching conversations at the intersection of faith and public life. At the heart of our mission is the belief that human flourishing for both individuals and their communities is best realized in a free society marked by a commitment to liberty, the marketplace of ideas, and democratic citizenship. In addition to hosting public events like this one, CFF supports student and community learning efforts of all sorts, from hosting reading groups and colloquia on campus to supporting student travel to national and international conferences. As I said last week, this year marks the 9th time John Brown University has hosted Reimagining Faith in Public Life. Since 2017, JBU has brought more than 20 Christian leaders and thinkers from across the political and ideological spectrum to Siloam Springs to reflect on the intersection of faith and public life. Due to a fluke in our calendar, this year's speakers appeared on different dates. A week ago, we were fortunate to hear from Daniel Darling on the virtues and challenges of Christian patriotism in this fractured political environment. And tonight, we're thankful to have with us an expert in national security, counterterrorism, and the growing challenge of political violence and extremism in America. But more than that, she is a thoughtful and committed Christian citizen and someone who, despite the challenges of our moment, remains hopeful about the promise of the American political experiment. As always, thanks to Michelle Sumner and Hope Brittenham for their assistance in planning and coordinating logistics for this event. I'm also thankful for the students who have gone out of their way to engage with this evening's speaker during class visits and over meals. And as for an order for this evening, we'll begin with some initial remarks from our speaker, followed by a brief conversation between the two of us. We'll then spend the remainder of our time taking your questions. Whether it's over a point of agreement, clarification, or contention, I do hope you'll take the opportunity to ask our question of our speaker. Elizabeth Neumann is a national security expert focused on counterterrorism and political extremism in the United States. She served in 2 different presidential administrations on homeland security issues. The first on the White House Homeland Security Council for President George W. Bush's White House, and the second in President Trump's first administration as Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention. She currently serves as Chief Strategy Officer for Moonshot, a company that tracks and counters online hate, extremism, and violence. She is the author of Kingdom of Rage, The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. And she's probably not going to say this herself, so I'll do it. There are some copies that are for sale. If you're interested in buying her book tonight, I'm sure she'll make you a good deal on the price. And Elizabeth and her husband live in Colorado with their 2 children. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Neumann.
Thank you. Well, good evening. Thank you for having me. I've been really enjoying my time on campus and meeting with students and alumni and professors, and it's a joy to be here. And thank you, Dan, for having me. And man, I wish there had been a center like what you guys are doing here for flourishing and civic life when I was in college. It would have helped a lot. Tonight, I want to talk to you about a slightly heavy topic, extremism. So it's really good that there's some Dubai chocolate back there and some macaroons, my daughter's favorite. I've already sent her a picture. So, you know, if you need to eat some chocolate to boost your serotonin levels, feel free. Extremism is a heavy topic, and we need to be sober-minded about it. So I want to talk about what it is, where we are seeing it grow, but most importantly, what we can be doing about it, especially as Christians. As Americans, we are not the first culture to live in fear and resort to violence as a consequence. And as an American church, we are not the first set of believers to have turned to worldly power, to security in the form of horses and chariots and swords, as we saw in the Old and New Testaments, as our solution instead of trusting in the Lord for our security. But I would suggest to you that we might be living in a time when it has never been easier to be radicalized. Now, why? Why? Because we are constantly exposed to the messaging that encourages extremism. Our culture is swimming in it, and I'll try to explain how that is happening. But before we get too far in the why, let's define our terms. The first is extremism. Let me start by saying what extremism is not. Fear or hatred of the other is not by itself extremism. It is a primary gateway drug, and science tells us it's pretty unhealthy for you, and it's healthy for our society, so I would not recommend it. But hate by itself is not extremism. Extremism is also not a belief that's outside of the mainstream. So let me give you an example. Women should be able to vote. That was an extreme view 200 years ago. That is not the type of extremism I'm talking about today. It's not a viewpoint that's outside of the mainstream. Extremism in my field is the belief that you or your in-group, your success or survival is at threat by some outgroup. And therefore, the only course of action is hostile action. The course of action is not to vote. The course of action is not to run for office, not to go talk to your school board or petition your congressman. The only course of action is hostile action. So let me repeat this definition because we're going to go through it. Extremism is the belief that you and your in-group's success or survival requires hostile action against the other. So let's take this definition apart. Notice the first element has an us-them context, your in-group. Now, sociologically, we are built to draw lines, to draw us and them. And that is actually normal, healthy behavior. Although, if anybody has anyone in middle school, you can know that it can get pretty ugly pretty fast, right? That us-them context, who is in, who is out. And it can get cruel. But that's not the only piece. It's not just an us and a them. It's also this existential threat. Your success or survival is at risk. Okay, so now if we stop right there, us, them, success and survival, I would submit to you that this is how our politics is today. This tribe is your survival, your success or survival is dependent upon your tribe winning power, your tribe being in office. The other side is out to get you and your family. And both sides do this. It's been this way for quite some time, but I would suggest that in the last 15 years, it's gotten a lot worse. It used to be, when I was growing up for college-age kids, they would fight it out during the campaign, but then they would shake hands, and then they would say, hey, this is our president. Let's get in line. We're all Americans. You don't see that much anymore. There are some politicians out there who are trying to exhibit, they're trying to recover that idea of, fight hard on the campaign trail, but treat one another like human beings. Governor Cox is an example. I think he does this well. But sadly, they're few and far between. What's worse is that parts of the American Christian community are actively participating in this. We see influencers, pastors, and people who say that they are Christians using dehumanizing rhetoric and spiritualizing the us versus them. Us, of course, is God's side. God is always on our side, right? And that means that them, they are, who's opposite of God? They're the devil, right? So we often use the term demonizing to talk about our opponents, but in the past 10 years, there actually have been people, a number of people who, with louder and louder voices and big platforms saying, rhetoric that actually is spiritualizing, demonizing the opponent. We have prominent influencers applying Ephesians 6, putting on the full armor of God, not as a defense against spiritual warfare that Paul is speaking to, but in preparation for going to battle against human enemies. This is despite the fact that in that same passage, Paul says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." He's very clearly talking not about a physical manifestation of war. But we now have people that are applying that passage in a physical, political realm. This has been happening for years, but it was on prominent display at, of all places, Charlie Kirk's memorial service. There was a contrast. If anybody watched, there were voices who were appropriately treating it like a memorial service and none so moving as Charlie Kirk's widow. Erica Kirk offered forgiveness. I mean, it's audacious. It is the call of in the following Jesus and forgiving somebody who had just murdered her husband. Very moving. But in that same service, multiple voices were calling for violence against them. They never quite said who the them was, but you could deduce it's liberals, it's anybody that's not MAGA, it's Antifa, it's domestic terrorists. They've applied a whole bunch of labels since, which is why we have more people today than in decades past that are willing to embrace the last part of that definition that I shared, the hostile action. Hostile action is a spectrum. It is not just the violence. It starts on a lower end, bullying, harassment, discrimination. The upper end moves into the criminal space, vandalism, destruction of property, hate crimes, terrorism, and genocide being the upper end of the spectrum. People usually start on the lower end. You don't just jump to murder. You usually are participating in the bullying, the harassment, the intimidation. These days, it's mostly happening online. And it's very easy, right? It's very easy to lose your cool online. And then you do it once, maybe feel bad about it. And then other people applaud you for it. It feels pretty good. My side likes me when I beat up on somebody. And so it creates a permission structure. You do a little bit more, a little bit more. Now, most people don't mobilize to violence. It's just a small portion. But here's what we know. What we know, and this is true globally, it's not just in the United States, where you have more people operating on that lower end of the spectrum, you end up with more violence. So it might be a small percentage that move to violence, but a small percentage of a large potential pool of vulnerable people that might consider violence or might even cognitively tell you violence is okay. A small percentage of a large whole is a large number. And I would submit to you that's what's happening in our country. So here's how extremism works. To reach a mindset that justifies the necessity of hostile action requires a story. It usually starts with finding identity with others through a set of grievances, which are blamed on that outgroup. Eventually, this builds into an ideology that frames the outgroup as an existential threat and provides a solution that justifies extraordinary measures of hostile action against the outgroup. But here's the thing about ideology that justifies violence. It turns out that exposure alone to an ideology is not enough to cause somebody to radicalize. This is good news because I would submit that every single person in this room has been exposed to extremist ideology at this point. It is that rampant in our society now. It's often in the form of memes. Half the time when I do a training, I'll show slides of memes that are associated with extremist ideology. And I'll ask usually the pastors or the parents in the crowd, go home, see if your kids have seen any of these. And inevitably I hear from a handful, yep, my kid's seen this. It's so ubiquitous. It's in the water we swim in. So you've been exposed, but not everybody is vulnerable to it. So what makes us vulnerable? So we've studied this for decades, especially after 9/11, a lot of research going into why does somebody join Al-Qaeda? Why does somebody want to kill us, right? We were desperate to try to figure this out. And we discovered that it's not really ideology that's the primary driver. The story matters because it builds the justification for the violence, but it's not the reason one radicalizes in the first place. The primary drivers are unmet psychosocial needs. Now, I'm going to oversimplify here. Radicalization is a complex process. It is not linear. But with that caveat, the most common unmet needs are belonging and significance. So when these basic needs go unmet, we become vulnerable and more cognitively open to extremist narratives. These are often activated in a group or individual who has an experience of humiliation, loss of control, uncertainty, and a sense of unaddressed justice. Think about that list. Have any of you experienced any of that in the last couple of years? How about COVID? Loss of control, great uncertainty. Now, some people experience these challenges, and of course, they don't radicalize. In fact, most people don't, good news. But that is likely because they have strong protective factors in their life, like a strong friendship or a community they can rely on to get through a difficult time. Religious faith is considered a protective factor. Others, perhaps, will never be exposed to extremist narratives, but as I mentioned, I think that's increasingly harder. I think most of us are exposed at some point. So let's now apply these concepts to our moment. We are in the 11th year of increasing attacks and plots, of mass attacks and plots, including ideologically motivated violence, political violence, and a recently newly coined term, nihilistic violent extremism. For 30 years, going back to when we started tracking this data in the early 1990s, the primary threats of violence came from the far right, and that is classified as anti-government extremism. So think the Oklahoma City bomber, anti-Semitic extremism. We've seen a lot of that lately, but that was very prevalent in really all forms of extremism, usually have some sort of anti-Semitic undercurrent, and white supremacist violent extremism. Those have been the most active in terms of attacks, plots, and death. They also happen to be the most lethal. With the exception of 9/11, which is certainly an outlier in terms of the numbers, far-right violence exceeds even Islamist jihadist violence for the past 2 decades. So think about that. We've fought 2 decades of wars overseas, and it was the right thing, and I participated in the counterterrorism movement to keep our country safe. And we were so focused on that threat over there because it so jarred us on 9/11. And yet we have lost more life and had more attacks coming from ideological violent extremism that's endemic to us. Now, we're in a slightly different moment, and we are seeing an uptick in far-left violence. We started to notice it about 2 to 3 years ago, and we were very concerned that if we saw the pendulum swing in terms of the election going back to Trump, we had heard from far-left movements, people that study them, ethnographic researchers that talk to people on the far left. They were taking up arms, and they were talking that violence might be their only solution. And we now have some data. It's early, and the data needs to be scrubbed and cleaned, as we like to say. But we do have data that show we might have more far-left attacks this year from far-right. That is stunning from a data perspective. So something's happening. We, in my field, have been talking about whether we're about to relive a 1960s, early 1970s moment. Assassinations, far-left groups. Far-left is the way that they think and the way that they operate don't like groups. Like, think about an anarchist. You don't like authority. So you tend to not do well in groups. And so they tend to not be very organized. But this moment might create the justification for them to change their tactics. And that might be what we're seeing play out. Finally, a growing number of attacks and disrupted attacks are coming from what we call nihilistic violent extremism. This is not on an ideological spectrum, though when they happen, you often hear it blamed on one side or the other. But when you look underneath the hood at what's going on in the person's life, their manifestos, the references to different past attacks, my community, my field doesn't look at it as an ideological movement as much as this is a group of people who have given up all hope. There's several different manifestations of this. There's something called the true crimes community, which is a loosely connected fandom celebrating serial killers, terrorists, and mass murderers. There were 9 averted and completed school shootings in 2024 coming from that community. 9. That's a lot. That kind of came out of nowhere. It was like a little side thing on the internet, and then in 2024 burst forth. There's another group that's affiliated called No Lives Matter. It's also associated with 764 and the comms network. And they have a core belief of misanthropy. Misanthropy? Am I saying that right? So one of their publications entitled Evil Has No Limits begins with a discussion on misanthropy and the phrase, "Kill or be killed, no lives matter." He goes on to describe himself as motivated by nihilism and pure hatred. So why are we seeing a jump in violence in the past decade? Some of this is because culturally we're more vulnerable to extremist narratives, and some of this is just, it's across, I would say it's global in nature in terms of living in the 21st century. Things like globalization leads to significant economic and demographic shifts. The 2008 financial crisis, more closer to home, we've had rapid mainstream cultural moral norms shift, increased isolation, lack of community, COVID, which is a great accelerator, but certainly not the cause here. And in general, we just live in a world that is rapidly changing, and that persistent uncertainty is happening at the same time that secularism has risen, and so there's less things to anchor us. There's less truth, there's less objective truth right now in our world. And people feel unmoored. And in that uncertainty and not knowing how to deal with things, they're more vulnerable to these grievances and messages that they encounter mostly online. Now, important fact, some of what we are dealing with was seeded by foreign enemies, primarily Russia, somewhat Iran, and somewhat China. But Russia is the primary foreign enemy that is playing in the game of keeping us polarized and fractured. But more importantly, especially for a room like this, where I'm assuming most of you are believers and trying to figure out how you navigate in this toxic mess that we're in, I want us to reflect on how our community may have contributed to some of this uncertainty instead of what Christ offers us, that anchor, that hope in an uncertain world. I think we have a number of vulnerabilities that have been built into American evangelicalism. I dive into more of them in my book, but some of the most significant, I would say, is the sin of idolatry. We have idolized our country, our whitewashed, inaccurate heritage story, American Christian culture, as being somehow supreme and the thing that we should all strive towards, as opposed to following the way of Jesus. We have forgotten that the church is bigger than any one nation. We have forgotten our primary identity as in Christ, the body of Christ. And we have forgotten that the body of Christ is made up of many tribes, tongues, and nations. We have chosen fear of man instead of fear of God. And we worship politics and power as our savior. And we're choosing the tools of Egypt, Babylon, Rome, instead of the ways of Jesus. With our identity tied to a political party, whenever its power is diminished or threatened, our community's identity also feels threatened. So you combine that with politicians and pastors and infotainment hosts that are trafficking in narratives that I'm using myself in this, conservative, white, evangelical Christians, that we're being marginalized, that we're being humiliated, that elites look down on us in flyover country. We're being told subtly and not so subtly that our significance and our power is going to be lost, our success, maybe even our survival is at stake. And so many of those narratives don't fully embrace extremism, but you can only go so long being told that your community is at risk before someone suggests we need to do something more than pray and vote. We often talk about radicalization as a funnel. the top of which is very large, and each layer gets smaller and smaller. And while it's a small percentage of people that make it their way down the funnel to commit that violent act, it is impossible to know who will be the ones that will. And so further, with multiple modern case studies of populism and political violence from around the globe, we know that public support for political violence encourages volatile people to move to violence, which is why we find ourselves in a precarious moment. Now, surveys vary, but an average over the last couple of years is that 26% of us, so 26% of American adults, that's 67 million people, have said violence is usually or always justified to advance a political objective. That's the definition of terrorism. Now, if you ask the question, do you support terrorism to achieve your political objective, the answer is going to be far lower. But you phrase the question right, and people's true thoughts come out. 3% of Americans, now this was taken in 2024, 3% of Americans believe political violence is justified right now. That's 8 million people. Anybody know how many sworn law enforcement officers we have in the country? I'll give away a free book. Somebody say something? 800,000. It's a good guess. 800,000. 800,000 cannot deal with 8 million potentially violent, let alone 67 million violent people. I have studied this problem for a long time now, and I will tell you, I think the only solution is we have to reduce the pool of potentially violent people. We can't have 26% of us walking around thinking, it's kind of okay. Violence is okay. So the truth is, and to brighten it up a little bit, mass violence remains a rare event, but mass shootings have doubled in a span of 7 years. Terrorism incidents have increased by 357%. That was between 2013 and 2021. Threats to the federal, legislative, executive, and judicial officials increased by 400% from 2017 to 2023. That doesn't include the last year and a half of political violence in those stats. We have grown so numb to these horrific attacks and have believed that there is a lie, that there's nothing we can do. And I am trying to beat the drum that we don't have to live this way. We actually have solutions. Now, I'm not going to talk to you tonight about all of the things the government should do. We can talk about that separately if you'd like. I want to talk to you about what we can do as a community. And part of it comes from understanding that people can change, we can prevent and disrupt radicalization, and we can help those that are radicalized to disengage from it. I acknowledge that in the moment we're in, it is really tempting to withdraw. There is so much chaos around us, and it feels like we have no power or agency to fix it. And so the easiest thing is to just step back. And I'm going to ask you, please don't. You will tell me, look, my church doesn't advocate for violence. I don't think it's okay for the government to abuse its authority, but what role do I really have? This is where we need to go back to our definition of extremism and how violence works. It becomes acceptable when norms are violated and not reestablished. It becomes acceptable when normal people who are like, I don't think that way. I'm not part of that 26%. But you're not standing up and pushing back against the person in your midst. 1 in 4 of us, somebody you know thinks violence is okay. And our calling is to be what sociologists call in-group moderates. Means you have to have the moral courage to say, no, that's not right. That's not what our faith teaches. The way we fight back against extremism is radical, disciplined, other-centered, and self-sacrificing love. We build bridges to people who have had different experiences and think differently than we do, and we commit to humility and curiosity in our engagement with others. And when they return our kindness with anger and hate, we commit to a gentle answer that turns away wrath. I'm not suggesting this to make you feel good or to quote the Bible. It's actually backed by brain science, social science, and practical experience from those who have clawed their way back from extremism. Put more simply, to push back against extremism, we recover discipleship in our churches and actually practice the way of Jesus. So let me close with this. I don't know what the next 3 or 30 years will bring, but as a national security expert, I do expect it to get darker. I think we have some tough days ahead. This isn't just about national security. We are a broken and hurting people. This is a spiritual sickness. But for a great move of the Holy Spirit, which I really would love to happen, I don't think this brokenness gets fixed quickly. It is very possible, maybe even most likely scenario, that a small remnant of us may recover discipleship and practice that other-centered love while the mainstream church in America continues on the path it's on. I don't know what God's plan is for the American church or for our country, but I do know that God has called us to seek the welfare of the city where we have been sent into exile and to pray to the Lord on its behalf. And this group probably knows this already, but it's worth reminding ourselves that that term welfare in Jeremiah 29:7 is the Hebrew word shalom, which is elsewhere translated peace. So that's our calling. That's where our generations find ourselves, called to be peacemakers, which is not for the faint at heart. You will be rejected. You will be hated by your tribe. We dig deep roots, we cultivated flourishing communities, and we seek the welfare of where God has placed us. We are faithful even when we do not know what God will do with our efforts. We trust Him, abide in Him, rest in Him, find our shalom in Him, and we help others find their shalom in Him too. That's the path back to peace. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that, and what a positive way to conclude those remarks and transition us to a time of questions. I'm going to situate myself a little bit differently up here. First of all, if you have not yet seen it, this is the book that you can get from Elizabeth after the event if you're so inclined. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions from folks who are here, but I will use my prerogative to ask a couple of questions at the outset. You kind of already addressed the problem of where political violence is coming from in the U.S. So if someone else wants to talk more about that in the Q&A, that's fine. But I want to ask actually maybe you to speak a little bit more about the work that you're doing now with Moonshot. Most of us probably spend some of our time online on an average day. And so I'm wondering if you could share with us how online spaces contribute to radicalization today compared to when you first started working on counterterrorism in the aftermath of 9/11.
Yeah, it's a great question. And there was some good research that came out of George Washington University's program on extremism, talking about the multiple waves of internet extremism. And I'd never paused. When you're in the moment, it's hard to be a researcher, especially if you're an operator. And I read this and I was like, this makes so much sense. So all credit to them. But when we first started countering terrorism in the form of Al-Qaeda, the ideology that was propagated by Al-Qaeda was controlled by very learned people who were gatekeepers to their ideology. So if you wanted to join their group, you usually had to know somebody in person, and you might have used the internet to be sent something in an email, but they weren't actively propagandizing online, and you usually met somebody in person. They checked you out, made sure, yeah, you're a true believer, and you joined their ideology, which sounds obvious now, but it'll shift here in the third wave. Second wave, around 2010, now we have Al-Qaeda propagandizing through video, and they would have people basically recruiting on video. And that kind of started to create the atomization of being able to, this propaganda for this type of person. Ideology became looser, wasn't as entrenched and deep. It was more not yet Vibe, but getting close to that. And shortly thereafter, ISIS comes along, and ISIS really democratizes, anybody can come and join the fight. You don't have to really pass a gatekeeper, just get yourself over here and join the caliphate. And then eventually, as they were starting to experience military defeat, it was like, no, don't come and join us. Just bring your own weapon to the fight, whatever you can do. If you're in Europe, get a knife, get a car, just kill as many people in the name of ISIS. In the United States, it's get a gun, kill as many people as you can. And it was very loose, decentralized, and the internet was key to that. You couldn't do what ISIS did without the internet. Flash forward to where we are now, third wave, ideology is almost like it's referenced and thinly veiled, but it's much more about vibe, memes, like people share memes instead of written text. So if you think about where Al-Qaeda was, where you remember, for those older in the audience, like the fatwa would come out and we'd all be like rushing to our favorite analyst to find out, what does this mean? Does this mean a new attack is coming? And like, they were very text heavy. Now it is all image based and vibe based. So the internet has been key in that transformation. So you go from a text heavy gatekeeper ideology to make your own ideology. That's what's happening now. It's pick your own ideology. You might take a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I didn't like that guy, but I do like this guy. And it's a lot of copycat behavior. And online, the way this manifests is you find communities who like past attackers and are glorifying them together and comparing notes on how they can do an attack better than the last guy. So you find that most people don't obviously jump straight to these gore sites or mass shooting glorification sites. They usually start in mainstream spaces, or they recruit, and they're recruiting our kids. They use gaming sites. They will pose as youth and start a relationship or a conversation, and then they'll suggest, let's leave this place and go to another place that's perhaps less has less controls over who is able to post what, and they move you down a pathway towards some of these darker sites that are less governed spaces, if you will. So that's a little bit of the online world. It's constantly morphing and changing, and we have ideologies that exist today that didn't exist 2 years ago, just to give you some context.
Well, you ended your remarks on a fairly positive note, but that was back to a very negative thing
Sorry.
here. No, I mean, it does seem like a whack-a-mole strategy of stamping out one person or a community, but then others take its place. I'm wondering, maybe you could speak to the possible solutions to this. Maybe speak very briefly about what can the government in the U.S. do, given the nature of the First Amendment, but maybe assuming not a lot, then what can we as a community do to try to push back or reject this?
Yeah, the government tried for quite some time to do content moderation. Did this in the fight against Al-Qaeda. I remember the first policy conversation we had about that was in 2005. We called it terrorist use of the internet. And lots of policies have come and gone trying to see if you can play whack-a-mole. And back then, when there wasn't that much of it, you could. You can't now. Like there's content moderation is kind of a fool's errand in many ways. So you have to use other tools. And it used to be you maybe could protect certain vulnerable people from exposure. Now, as I explained in my remarks, that's like impossible. It's almost mainstream how some of these ideologies manifest. And so if you can't protect people from being exposed, what you need to be doing is building the protective factors. You have to assume we're all going to be exposed at some point. You also have to assume, sadly, that you're going to have a life crisis, right? Because that when those two things combine, the life crisis, the great uncertainty that that we're just constantly living with now. And the exposure, that's when somebody's really vulnerable. But if you can build up protective factors, then you can resist when somebody's feeding you a grievance narrative or telling you that the reason for your problems are these people over here, the them, and you should do something about it. So how do you build protective factors? There's a role here for government. There's a role here for the community. I would say when it's building protective factors, that is largely not something we want government doing. Now, there might be some roles, say, in education for media literacy, teaching people how to find facts. Conspiracy theories are often on-ramps to radicalization. So if we can teach kids how to do a better job of detecting what might be a conspiracy theory and not based in fact, that's good. Protective factors can be communal, they can be individual, and largely, I would say, if your biggest unmet needs are that need of significance and belonging, I would say the church has great answers for those, right? Our significance is in Christ, our belonging is in Christ. And I'm not saying that in a simplistic way, that in order to discover the richness of that takes a long time and a lot of discipleship. But we do have, I think, the best answer for those needs. But we also need, as a community, to figure out why are our young men struggling so much? Why is there such a heartache for me? Like, there's a sense that their life is meaningless. Why is there this growth of nihilism in our culture that nothing matters? Like, I think we need to be having cultural conversations across communities. And while I think the right answer is Jesus, I think there can be other answers too, but it's got to go deeper than what our culture has offered so far. And then on the government role, once somebody is radicalized, we've developed a system of intervention that allows opportunities for mental health professionals to engage with that person and try to address those unmet needs. It really does need to be somebody that's a licensed counselor, somebody that's been trained not only professionally to be a counselor, but upskilled to be able to address somebody that might be on a pathway to violence. There are a couple of states that are doing this work. The federal government was funding states to build out these systems. Those programs have since stopped in this administration as part of the DOGE cuts. They cut all that funding. But there are states where they are doing it, and they've disrupted attacks in the process. So I'm a big believer that we could build out that infrastructure at a state level and reduce violence in the country.
This will be the last question that I ask, and then I do want to turn it over to folks in the audience with their questions. And if you do have a question, Michelle Sumner in the back will be able to walk around with the microphone. So just indicate that you'd like to ask a question. But I guess this is a somewhat selfish question in the sense that I have 3 kids. The oldest is 13, youngest is 10. You have children as well.
14 and 11.
14 and 11. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so right in there. There are parents in the room with kids maybe around that age. As students certainly might have brothers and sisters in that age. So, what are some things, and maybe just to draw on your personal experience, what do you do to keep, as someone who studies this and practices this, to do the best that you can to keep your kids from, getting to that point of getting exposed to this type of thing?
Certainly when they're younger, I would encourage limiting screen time. And my ninth grader got a phone for the first time last year. So delaying access to phones as long as possible. We used watches for communication when we needed to, have them go somewhere and be able to reach us. Neither of my kids are on social media. I have heard some recent stats that we're actually turning the tide through some of the work that Jonathan Haidt has been promoting about reducing cell phone usage. For the first time, we're starting to see kids are spending less time on their devices, and the year in which a kid gets a phone is starting to increase. So maybe we're turning this around a bit, but that's probably like just in terms of real practical recommendation, it would be really cautious about when you give them a device and in what context are you able to use that device. Once they have a device, so my kids have had a tablet that they played with since younger years, but there have been pretty strict boundaries about when and where they can use it, and still to this day there are no devices allowed in rooms, and that's just to protect them from both temptation as well as bad people online will trick you into a whole host of things. One of the challenges, though, that is kind of new is that we are seeing groups intentionally extort kids, usually using gaming sites. And they come in and they will build a relationship, pretending usually to be their age and their friend. And it used to be you tried to get them to send you a picture, usually a nude. And then they would use that to extort and say, if you don't do what I want you to do, then I'm going to post this on social media or I'm going to tell your parent. Now they just take your headshot or whatever picture you might have published somewhere, whether it's on that gaming site or they go look you up on Instagram, and they will AI generate a nude. And as you can imagine, this is the most horrific thing a 12-year-old could ever envision happening. And we've actually seen suicide attempts and a couple of actual suicides come from this movement, because it's too much for a 12-year-old to have to deal with. So how do we protect against that? We talk to our kids about it early and often. Just like we talk to them about sex, we need to be talking to them about bad people online, and that no matter what you do, you can always come to me. And I'm always going to be on your side and we'll figure it out. Nothing that can happen to you, I won't be there for, even if you screw up, right? And so you drill that into them at an early age. You come to me. If you see something online, you don't understand it, please come talk to me. I'm not going to get angry at you. And you have to create that trust so that if they do get extorted, they're going to come to you. Or if they're in that stage when they don't like you as a parent, have worked to develop other safe adults that they could turn to. So the goal in getting through and navigating this period, you talk to them about it, you don't hide it from them, and you do it age appropriate. You're not going to talk about sextortion to a 5-year-old, but you do, but I would say by 8, 9, 10, you need to be using age-appropriate language to let them know there are bad people that would like to harm them online, and it's my job to keep you safe, and you don't need to know the details, but if you see something that concerns you or makes you uncomfortable, I want you to show me. I want you to tell me what you're saying. And you start that really young and you keep it up and you talk to them frequently in age-appropriate language.
Who would like to ask the first question?
Anybody ready for chocolate now?
There's a couple left. Last I saw, a couple left.
Thank you very much. My concern, I teach 3rd and 4th graders in Sunday school. I am convinced that we have to help the children at that age or earlier, possibly, because I'm sorry, by the time they're teenagers, good luck. So my question is, are there any programs out there that you would say are really good that would help someone like myself, being a Sunday school teacher? I'm not a parent, so I can't do those kind of things, but I could do some things in my lessons.
That is such an interesting question, and I've never thought about it in the context of Sunday school, but I love the idea. There are some resources I trust. They are not necessarily Christian resources, but although Plugged In Online is Focus on the Family, I believe, and they don't necessarily talk about keeping kids safe online, but that is sometimes a resource I go to. See, I'm bad with names and I'm blanking on the name. why don't I follow up with you afterwards, because I bet I can find it on my phone pretty quickly. But there are a number of groups. Wait till 8th is the movement of trying to keep kids from having cell phones until encouraging parents to keep kids from having cell phones till they're in 8th grade, because they recognize it's a community-wide problem. It's what's the term? Community. Jonathan Haidt uses it all the time. Collective action problem. There we go. Collective action problem. If your kid opts out, but everybody is still in, that your kid's going to be ostracized, and that's not good either. And so we kind of have to build parents, youth leaders, education and knowledge about this, and create spaces. So if you have kids with cell phones coming into Sunday school, you could put a over-the-door shoe rack and say, hey, we're going to put our cell phones in here. A lot of schools are doing that. You could encourage conversations about how do we know what's truth, and how do we know what somebody is saying online is actually that they are who they say they are, or that what they're presenting is true. So there's a number of things you could probably weave in to we're people of the truth, right? Trying to understand what God's truth is and how that manifests currently in the digital age. But I'll follow up with you and get you some of those resources.
And I appreciate what you've had to say. I really appreciate what you've had to say about application and the serious need that we have in our country for de-escalating the extremism that we see. I would like to add to the statistic that you offered. You said 26% of adults are in favor of committing political violence, but actually I looked at this right before coming here tonight. This was a survey done after the Charlie Kirk shooting in September. 18 to 44-year-olds in our country, 26% of those who call themselves liberal are okay with committing political violence, and 7% of those who are conservative in that age range are okay with political violence. So it is actually a larger statistic than the number that you cited. But we do see that slant, which I do think I've personally seen changing in these recent years, of seeing more violence being committed by those with a left-leaning basis, and as I think you called it, the secular nihilistic extremism. With your previous work, you've written about extremism coming from the church, but I agree with you that we have the best answer for these needs, in particular those who have that nihilistic experience. So do you have do you have knowledge of Christians becoming violent extremists in that way? Or do you see it as an issue with right-wing rhetoric inflaming leftist violence, in which case that might be considered victim blaming, like, look what you made us do? So do you see Christianity and Christians as being a source for those issues, or do you see that we also have the particular need that maybe this crowd needs to simmer down and come to peace?
Yeah, so when I wrote the book, I wrote it from an effort to try to understand the community I came from, which is conservative Christian community, because I'm a big believer that it's important that we bring healing within, and it's very easy to go out and criticize a group that I'm not a part of, my other, if you will, which would be liberals or the left. And if Dan had asked me to come and explain all of the problems with left-wing violent extremism, I can do that too, because I'm equally against violence, and that's my field as we go and study and understand where it manifests and why. But from a personal perspective, it was important for me to understand why we had so many people showing Christian symbols, showing, doing prayers and holding signs with Bible verses, and beating police officers on January 6th. It's really what drove me to write the book, is trying to understand, like, I missed this. How did this happen? I don't think, and I think the data bears this out, if you're actually attending a church regularly and have a practice of prayer and Bible study, you are not likely to at all be vulnerable to violence. I don't think a Christian who's deeply practicing their faith is the concern here. I think the concern is that we have a lot of political people who have taken the name of Christ and are very open, because they aren't rooted in Christ, because they aren't actually following the way of Christ, become very vulnerable to the message that it's okay to use violence to achieve the power that we want. The poll that I cited is the UC Davis survey that's ran from 21, and the last year that they published was 24. So that 26%, it went up to 35, it came down, it's hovered around 26% the last 2 years. There are multiple other polls out there that ask the question slightly differently, and you get this range from, and you're the political scientist, you could explain this better, but it ranges from like 15% to 45%, depending on how you ask the question. What has shifted this year is the uptick in far left. We started to see it, and just the average liberal, if you will, willing to accept violence as an option. I am struggling with how do we talk about this in the context of, when you're talking about a white supremacist, violent extremist, or an anti-government extremist, their stories, their ideology, if we sat here and went through it, you could say that's a conspiracy theory, that's not true, that's a conspiracy, that's not true. And they work themselves up into like kind of a catastrophizing sense of like, this is the only choice I have, is to take up arms or to go commit a mass shooting. The far left does this too, around the environment, around being anti-capitalist, being anti-institutionalist. That's mostly how they've manifested over the years. But this year is different. It's that, and people in the mainstream who are now open to violence as a solution. And so when you talk to a mainstream person, part of that 26% you're citing, they're not necessarily affiliated with an anarchist movement or Antifa. They're not a traditional far left. They're mainstream people who are scared. What are they scared about? They're scared that the government is going to come for them. The problem is that the government actually has done things that are unlawful, that courts have said, you've violated the Constitution. You've exceeded your authority here. And so what's the response then? At that point, it's not a conspiracy theory, it's based in fact. Now, they're still potentially catastrophizing. The chance that the government's going to come for you specifically is probably pretty small, but it is happening. And then there's a question of what's the right thing for us as the American people, where it's our vote. It is we, the people, that make up that government. And if we're seeing injustice occur, what's the answer there? Now, I would like to say it's not violence. I can't find anywhere in Scripture that allows us to use violence, even against an abusive government. As difficult as it is to watch what the government's doing, we are not yet Rome. And even under the Roman Empire, Paul did not advocate violence. So I just don't see any biblical justification for violence as an answer. But I can absolutely appreciate why people are scared and why they're looking for answers. And in that space, they're vulnerable to the solution of violence. So I understand how it's happening. I do think this is a moment for us to look at history and in the past, like what can the church do when we're faced with abuse? And the civil rights movement is probably the closest thing in our history, where the nonviolent civil rights movement, which was led by the church, the Black church, that might be something that we need to be better students of. What does that look like? The amount of discipline that went into just learning how to cross a bridge. If you've ever been to Selma, if you've ever studied that movement, it's quite amazing, the amount of discipline and self-control they had to have to exercise just that moment. I don't think we're discipled in that. I don't know that we have that level of self-control. And so I do think it's something that we, the church, need to wrestle with. How do we love our neighbor who is maybe receiving that abuse of government authority? What does it look like to mourn with them? What does it look like to speak on their behalf and say this isn't right? But to do so non-violently, I think, is the call.
Hi, is this working? I wondered, I've noticed a lot of Christians recently, as a specific example, they're very like enthusiastic about like plots to kill Hitler. Like it's viewed, and it's very not historically, like there's some twisting of historical facts in order to make this work, but it's viewed as like a Christian movement and a spiritual thing that Christians should use violence against evil people. And like, do you consider that to be problematic? Because we're obviously not at a place where there is a genocide happening. So I've heard people being like, hey, maybe we shouldn't use that kind of example of something that extreme and push that. Sorry, I probably didn't say that well.
No, I've heard that too. And I want to say that there's often there must be a course in seminary. I've not been through seminary, but it seems to come up in hypos with pastors on, when is violence justified? And theologians disagree. I mean, there are some that are complete pacifists. I mean, the Quaker movement was a believer in always nonviolence. Preston Sprinkle today is somebody that advocates that viewpoint, and I think it's a very noble viewpoint to have. I obviously was in the counterterrorism field, and so we use state violence to keep ourselves safe, right? Like the military is violent in order to defend us. So I personally am in a place of there are times and spaces where I believe God has instituted governments to keep people safe, and that there is a role for that in a different context. I think one of the things I've always wanted to dig deeper on is what would my opinion have been during the American Revolution. That's a really interesting challenge as a believer to think through. And I have to just be thankful that that was not the time and place that God put me, that there were other people there for that decision, because I love our country and I'm glad we're here. But the specific to the Hitler question, I don't know. I think it's hard in a hypothetical sense to try to place ourselves back in history, and we're absent what the real context was of living in that moment. We can read it, but we're not actually experiencing it. And I don't think that's where we are. So I don't think there's a parallel to draw in our present moment. We have courts that are working. We have elections coming up, and we have a vote, and we still have a voice. And so we have systems in place that are nonviolent to be able to push back against injustice. And it is imperfect. The courts are slow. People are experiencing their civil liberties violated in some cases, have experienced real harm, and getting money paid out by the government 2 years from now doesn't really change the fact that you were traumatized or harmed. So it is imperfect, but I think the system is still working, and I don't know that I am at a place where I would draw that parallel to Germany yet, Nazi Germany.
I didn't mean so much like, would that have been right historically? Because that I have thought about too. But the fact that there are Christian pastors who are making that parallel, and you hear that that theme show up a lot. Like, do you find that to be a worrying trend?
I don't know that that's helpful. I would need to see the full context of what they're talking about. I think sometimes people draw historic examples, maybe to draw a contrast, like we're not there, or this is what people in worse circumstances, how they endured, like my drawing a parallel to Paul and living in the Roman Empire, recognizing we are in much, much better circumstances. And if Paul's call is this in a worse circumstance, surely we can do what Paul called for us to do. So I would need to know the full context, but generally speaking, no, I don't think it's helpful to draw that parallel because it tends to catastrophize as opposed to focus on the facts that we're currently dealing with.
So, considering the amount of influence that churches have over their congregation, do you believe that churches should be making political statements at all? And if so, how do they avoid idealizing a certain political alignment?
I'm going to say one thing and then answer your question. The first is the Holy Spirit uses different pastors in different churches for different purposes, and we're all a part of the body of Christ. And so what one pastor might be called to do might be very different from what another pastor is called to do. And the Spirit is big enough and the church is broad enough that he uses all of us in different ways. So I don't know that I am in a position to say that was wrong and that was right. I think my red lines, get really uncomfortable when a pastor or anybody on a Sunday worship context is using that worship service to promote a political candidate that for me feels wrong. I didn't used to be this way, but I'm increasingly uncomfortable with flags at the front of a sanctuary during worship. I think it can get easy to get confused what we're worshiping and that we're bigger than our country. I know Dan was talking about patriotism, and I'm patriotic. I love patriotism.
Well, I was actually going to use this as an opportunity to maybe tee up and we're running short on time here, but a brief response, if you could tease out something that you appreciated about Dan's talk because you did watch it, but then also something that you might, if you had been here, not, disagreed with necessarily, but maybe colored in a different way. And so maybe finish responding here. And then I know a student in the back had a question as well.
Yeah. Dan and I know each other and very much respect his ministry, and I like that he wrote this book on patriotism. There's a lot of conversation right now about needing to separate our faith and our politics and go back to Jesus is preeminent. But that doesn't mean, and at least I don't believe that means that we can't also love our country. And so the very much aligned with the order of the loves and, C.S. Lewis's vision there of patriotism and love of country is a good thing. It's a blessing to be in this country. Dan and I kind of approach our roles maybe a little differently. I think Dan, and you heard him, there was a question that you asked about extremism and violence, and he very much viewed it in the lens of how others are painting the church. And I appreciate that. And when I talk to a left-leaning audience or liberals, I will tell them, you are not making it easier on me as an in-group moderate, trying to encourage us to live in the way of Jesus and to reject extremism. It doesn't help when you guys paint with a broad brushstroke. It doesn't help when you make us all out to be Christian nationalists. Most of us are not Christian nationalists. So if you're talking to one audience, that message is important. When you're talking to a predominantly Christian audience, it's a different calling, different message. And so I think he is slower to see some of the challenges that I'm trying to draw out. But I think he also has a different place and different calling. And that back to the question of different pastors and what they speak. We all have different ministries, and God has equipped us differently to serve the body in different ways. And I feel like my calling in this moment, in this time, is to raise awareness that we have this challenge, that it is not over there, it is in our midst. And that doesn't mean that you are the problem, but you might know somebody that that is open to violence, and we should be having those conversations about what Jesus actually calls us to, and by reconnecting people to Jesus, hopefully reduce violence. But generally speaking, I am going back to the question about the role of pastors in politics. I do think that we're experiencing in the broader American church people that are co-opting our faith and that are using our faith for political purposes. And I do think there are some pastors that are called to say, no, my faith, our faith, Jesus is not a political prop. Jesus is higher than the politics. God does not have a side. And I do think from a what is a pastor supposed to do? I know I've talked to a lot of pastors, and there are some that try really hard to be neutral, and there are moments that we are experiencing right now where I don't know that you can be neutral. I think in choosing neutrality, you're actually choosing a side. And so I do think that there's a way to be a pastor and not necessarily be preaching one side or the other. That's not what I'm suggesting, but I am suggesting that the moment that we are experiencing as a culture is such that we need the prophetic witness of God's word. And sometimes that means saying the world says this, but Jesus says this. And that goes both sides, right? Like it's a whole host of challenges that we're facing as a country. I think if a pastor's doing his job well, you're offending both sides equally, right? Like you can, Tim Keller wrote this great piece in 2020 about there isn't actually a good rubric to put Jesus's teaching onto a Republican or a Democrat. Like if you lay it out, you're offending both sides pretty equally. And so, yeah, if you're not offending from time to time, then you might not be preaching the full counsel of God.
I think we're going to have time for one more question with a student in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking here tonight. I would say that America is in what Dr. Brad Wilcox would call a male loneliness epidemic at the moment. And I was just wondering if you could speak on, as we see, it is mainly like statistically young white men who are committing these acts of mass shootings, mass violence. And I was just wondering what we as the church or individuals could do to support these individuals or people groups that are more susceptible to the sway of maybe online political violence or physical political violence.
Yeah, loneliness is that underlying need of belonging. Yeah, it's definitely a key contributor to what we are dealing with. The why behind that loneliness, we saw the uptick in attacks starting in 2015. So you can't say it's COVID. You can't say that we're just living in post-COVID society, and that's the sole problem. Like this was starting well before that. You possibly could tie it to smartphone usage increasing to a point where we're mostly like this these days instead of looking at each other in the eyes. We do know, you didn't exactly say this, but I just wanted to take the opportunity to clarify a myth. Going back to the 90s, there was this belief that online violent video games were contributing to people committing acts of violence. The data doesn't show that. Now, I personally don't like violent video games. I don't let my kids do it, but that it's not because of a data-driven thing. It's more of a just moral code, I suppose, and just the way the Lord has led my family. The data says people that play those games are not disproportionately likely to go commit an attack. Here's where there is correlation. People that are very online. So if you're a gamer and you're spending most of your waking hours online, you are now more at risk of committing an act. That's true for people that spend a lot of time online. So maybe it's an older person and they're not playing a game, but they're on Facebook all the time. So very online is a risk factor. Again, a small percentage of people ever mobilized to violence, but those types of factors, and you can imagine if you're spending most of your waking hours online, what does that mean you're not doing? You're not encountering people in real life. And so that means you're not having true connection, and you're likely to be very lonely. So any monocausal answer is going to be wrong. It is a complex set of factors, but loneliness, the fact that there is this loneliness epidemic that has been talked about now for 20, 25 years, going back to Putnam and Bowling Alone, we clearly have a problem and we haven't solved it yet. So it's something that we definitely need to try to figure out.
Well, that'll have to be the end of our questions tonight. I imagine Elizabeth will stick around for a few minutes and chat if you have something that you would like to talk with her about. There's also some books available. But until then, thank you all so much for being here. And thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.